Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. On this week's episode, I welcome fellow pharmacist and the co-founder and CEO of Pricklee Cactus Water, Kun Yang. Highlights from the show include hearing from Kun about how and when he knew the entrepreneurial path was right for him, what the experience was like being on Shark Tank, where he effectively navigated a negotiation with two sharks that led to a deal, and the skills that he has had to acquire that have been most important to his entrepreneurial journey and leading a growing beverage company. Now, before we jump into today's show, I recognize that many listeners may not be aware of what the team at YFP Planning does in working one-on-one with more than 280 households in 40 plus states. YFP Planning offers fee-only high-touch financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. If you're interested in learning more about how working one-on-one with a certified financial planner may help you achieve your financial goals, you can book a free discovery call at yfpplanning.com. Whether or not YFP Planning's financial planning services are a good fit for you, know that we appreciate your support of this podcast and our mission to help pharmacists achieve financial freedom. Okay, let's jump into my interview with Kun, the co-founder and CEO of Pricklee Cactus Water. Kun, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Tim. Nice to see you again.
So we had an interesting crossing of paths through a mutual connection in the biopharmaceutical industry space, where we've done some personal finance education with some of the fellowship programs. You spent the early part of your career before working on Pricklee in an industry role. So let's start there. Tell us about your career path into pharmacy, where you went to school, and what led you to going down that path of industry.
Yeah, so I graduated from the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy 2015. I have a lot of pride in my alma mater, and I think many people might relate to this, but it's almost like the further removed you get, the more you realize how lucky really you were in that situation. But I had a chance to kind of go back this past year as the white coat speaker, and it just brought back a flood of just really incredible memories and just appreciation for just how difficult it is to be faculty and kind of lead the next generation of youth, and just had a lot of proud moments to kind of know where we kind of came from in that space. But I kind of grew up all over the place, mostly grew up in Canada, and always knew that I wanted to pursue health and wellness in many different components, and also had a very, I guess, just entrepreneurial mindset to begin with. And so I think pharmacy really kind of attracted me because fundamentally so much of pharmacy as an industry has been built upon, independent business, and just the kind of skills that are, required to be successful, to be able to socialize, to connect with your patients and provide value and help them lead healthier and better lives and be that trusted, partner. Really kind of just gravitated to that profession. And so as I entered pharmacy school, I think I realized that there was a lot of different ways that we could make an impact in society. And over time, as I learned more and more about all the incredible opportunities to affect population health and take all the skills that we were getting in pharmacy school and apply them in really creative ways, I just naturally gravitated towards more quote unquote non-traditional roles. But I would just say that they were just roles that I think allowed us to flex additional, skills that we didn't know we had. And then, eventually ended up pursuing a fellowship through MCPHS at Biogen in a sort of medical value-based outcomes type program, which was sort of a managed care focused direction, because I was very involved with AMCP and was very interested in the whole population health management piece of that profession going into graduation. And then, through that, just, really found myself appreciating and just developing a lot of incredible skills in the biotech pathway.
You and I talked maybe a week or two ago, and we were talking about for those students that have that, business or entrepreneur type of desire. I think the industry pathway is a natural one where there's some exposure, to that. But certainly that's still a step away from entrepreneurship and growing your own company. Still a very different experience working within an organization, although of course less clinical and more business minded. And I'm curious, before we talk about Pricklee specifically, was there a moment during your fellowship, or perhaps a moment in your first job where you looked around and you're like, man, this just isn't for me. Like, I've got this entrepreneurial itch. I've got this pharmacy degree. Maybe I've been down this pathway, but like, I don't see myself doing this for 30 years.
I think there were a lot of moments when I look back. It wasn't like, I think one specific, I mean, I do have a specific moment that I'll share, but I think there were a lot of feelings that I think that felt familiar to me, even in that moment, that I can kind of trace back and say, okay, this kind of makes a lot of sense. And so the moment really was walking into, I had just finished our fellowship and program and had started at a new company. It was a spinoff
Mm-hmm.
of our existing fellowship business, and kind of just walked in and had really, really fallen in, deep appreciation for the opportunity and the people that I was working with. But I think one of the days I kind of walked in and I looked around, and this was still pretty early on in our journey, but something hit me that I had always thought that through all the different, career changes and exploration of getting to that point, that going this quote unquote non-traditional path would have led me to move away from this feeling of quote unquote imposter syndrome, or feeling like, everything that I was doing was actually getting more and more specific. And it was
Yeah.
because it was leading me to a point of clarity, right? And really over time, I realized that imposter syndrome and point of clarity had a lot to do with an understanding of who I wasn't, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to understanding of who I was. And I think that's something that probably a lot of us can relate to, is growing up in your 20s and you're even maybe sometimes your early 30s. You have a lot of ideas of maybe what you don't like to do,
Yes.
right? Or what are some of the things that don't excite you, and what are some of the general things that do excite you, but you may not really understand specifically why, or what you're really good at to allow you to succeed in those roles. So again, all those feelings led to that one moment I walked in and looked around in this open office setting, and I was kind of like, man, there's a lot of incredibly talented and smart individuals around me. And if I work really, really hard here for another 15, 20 years, I could really be like one of them, and these were at the time, again, all my heroes that I looked up to,
Yeah.
that kind of forged the pathway for us before. And I guess it hit me in that moment that there wasn't a specific role that I could look at and say, like, that is exactly in specific
Yes.
what I wanted to do.
Yep.
And I think that was I call it a quarter life crisis moment of really all that imposter syndrome bubbling and kind of blowing up all at once, realizing that, wait a second, how could I have done all this and pursued all
Yeah.
this specificity only to feel this still in this moment? There's not much more specificity I could pursue. And that was when it really kind of became an introspective question of, like, is there something outside of pharmacy that I could apply my skills to, still within the health and wellness space that we were really passionate about, that I could find, truth and clarity in.
And where do you attribute, obviously you have an entrepreneurial spirit and desire. You're pursuing that with the work that you're doing at Pricklee. And I suspect this may not be the first venture and the last one that you're going to do. Where do you attribute that entrepreneur spirit coming from?
It's a really good question. I think it is family driven in many, many ways, right? I'm a first generation American. My father actually immigrated over from China when I was one, and I moved over to Canada when I was three and a half. And
Hmm.
to see kind of his journey and where he came from, where it was a small farm town, he was the first person in his entire family lineage to graduate high school and then to do college and all that stuff. And wasn't like there were resources around him. So for him to kind of persevere and find a way through all that,
Hmm.
pursue higher education, and then, bring us over and create a better life for his family, and then give us this opportunity then to, live a really privileged life of education, of connectivity, of culture, of just growing up in North America, Canada, and the US, and really being shielded from a lot of that. And realizing that for me, a lot of the journey of getting to really, I guess, in many ways, what I had initially idealized as a pinnacle of success, which was,
Hmm.
I think, much more defined from a lower, wealth generation value standpoint of,
Yep.
like, earning and salary and maybe comfort from a capitalistic standpoint, getting to that point and realizing that it was much more than that,
Hmm.
that was behind the growth that, my father and sacrifices my father had made. And to look at that journey that he went on as a pretty entrepreneurial one himself, I think I got a lot of that same sort of mentality of, like, okay, like, this still feels like a great opportunity has been presented. How can you take this opportunity and truly make a bigger impact, and take that opportunity and say, if you have that privilege and you have the connections and maybe the skill sets and the network to do more, to truly make an impact on society, can you look introspectively and find authenticity in that journey to make that impact as positive and helpful as possible? So that's really kind of where I think the initial energy came from.
I love that, Quan. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think your alma mater, to give them some credit, is light years ahead in terms of a focus around entrepreneurship and non-traditional career paths. And, they put some specific efforts in that area to really be intentional and brand themselves as such. But I've often thought, like, we recruit for someone who wants to be a pharmacist and that clinical type of a mindset, and then hope we can apply some entrepreneurial principles on top of that. I almost wonder if we need to flip the script in that, like, you recruit people that have an entrepreneurial mindset or interest, and then pharmacy gets overlaid on top of that. And it's just a totally different shift in, how someone is thinking. And I think what's interesting about your journey, and I think there's a lot of people that may feel some of that imposter syndrome or feel that tug and pull of like, hey, I have an interest in this or that, but my identity is in, I have a PharmD, or I've done a fellowship, or I've done 2 years of residency. And we know the reality of the sunk cost fallacy of, hey, I'm $200,000 in, right? And, I'm not going to pivot or take that risk. And so I just think there's a really neat opportunity for our academic institutions to be able to take this up and see what we can do in terms of some of the disruption that's happening in our profession, and how can we, especially as we train the next generation of pharmacists, be a part of that. And I think, to Maryland's credit, they're making some progress in this area, which is pretty cool.
I think that that's a very, very, very astute point. And I would just say, like, still early on in my journey. So I imagine that my view on this and perspective will change over time. But I would say that what I found in our journey, where we've kind of really broken into multiple industries now, right? And almost from the bottom up, and try to find value in that. It really comes down to aligning the journey to some core set of values that are intrinsic to an individual. And I think that that's something that a lot of institutions have maybe not done effectively. I think obviously professionalism and I think core behaviors of what a profession should look and act like are definitely important. But I do think that sometimes, a lot of students come into these professions with personal values that are maybe extremely different.
Yeah.
Right. And these personal values are often shaped by households and maybe by your initial friend network. Right. And I guess the challenge of this is, then if most people are within this way of this mindset of thinking, you go through life really kind of reflecting the same values that you've kind of been around since you were a kid, right? Your parents' values and the friends that you've kind of grown up with. And it's really hard to break free from that, right? Because as you get more and more within a bubble of people in terms of the work that you do, and your interests become even more specific, the challenge that you own become more specific. It's probably very hard for an average pharmacist to relate to, like, the challenges that a construction worker, for example, would relate to day to day. And so naturally, these worlds don't collide as often as you would see, right? So what does that really result in? That results in people finding answers and to, like, these bigger questions of, like, how do we become more entrepreneurial, or what can we do with our pharmacy professions? And they find answers amongst their direct community.
Yes.
Now, why is that challenging? Well, it's challenging because a lot of people that go into higher education, they come from families where maybe their parents didn't do this, right? Or maybe this is now a wealth generation they've entered, making pretty healthy salaries, where their parents didn't have that luxury, right? And so what happens is you're now asking, maybe your reference point of, like, what success looks like is anchored to people that have never had the type of wealth opportunity that you do now. And so to find answers to the questions of, like, well, what's next? If we've hit our milestones of getting your house, or, like, having children and doing these things that seemed like pretty far reaching milestones previously, and you're starting to trend in that direction where it's pretty feasible. Then you start asking, well, what's next, right? And then the answers often become, okay, invest your money, do these things, and grow your wealth. And then simultaneously, all right, who else would you ask? You ask your friends and your colleagues, who again were raised by the same kind of parents, right, that you've been around. So it's really hard to get answers to these bigger questions of how do you make more out of the way that our institutions are set up, when a lot of the influence of what the values are in society are really limited to the same influences and values that you were raised with, right? So what I found is, when you want to answer a question as big as what's next, right, ask people that have done those things. And so a lot of the mentors that I've met in my life that have made these tremendous impacts, I mean, they've built and exited companies, global companies. They've done these things, and time and again, you start to realize that oftentimes the value system changes from one of just wealth creation to one where you start to realize that your wealth is really a set of tools that you can leverage to create value for others, and to create not just a better life for yourself, but for your profession, for people around you, for anyone, right? And I think as you meet more and more successful people that have gone through that journey, you really feel that. And it's not only just really inspiring to see that that's really what people stand for at the end of the day, but that's what the world and the universe tends to
Yes.
reward in the long term.
That's such a great point. And I'm reading right now Hangry by the Grubhub founder. And it's a great book. Reminds me a lot of Shoe Dog is another great read on kind of a entrepreneurial startup story. That one obviously of Nike and Phil Knight. But he talks about in the Grubhub journey, like his initial goal was like do this thing to be able to pay off student loans.
Yeah.
And then he gets to this point where, he raises $31 million, and he gives up a stake of a company. And then it's like, oh, wow, this got like really real. And obviously I'm now exceeding that goal and there's on to something else. And then obviously at some point he exits what will be, a multi-billion-dollar company. And then he's kind of asking this question of like, all right, that wealth and obviously paying off that debt was a very small goal. The wealth was achieved, but like, I'm trying to find my identity back of like, who am I? What do I want to be? And what do I want to be my legacy and my contribution? So let's shift gears and talk about Pricklee. For those that aren't familiar with Pricklee yet, and I hope they will become soon if they're not already or they haven't tried the product. What is it and how did the idea come to be?
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting story. So Pricklee is a cactus water. It's a delicious, refreshing cactus water made from really the most sustainable and resilient plant on the planet, the prickly pear cactus. It's packed with electrolytes, antioxidants, vitamin C, that just offers superior natural hydration. It's got half the sugar and calories of a coconut water,
Mm-hmm.
and is really just good in smoothies by itself. Mixed drinks and really any which way you want to have it. So that's really what Pricklee is, and we actually created Pricklee right in the middle again of our fellowship. Our co-founder Mo grew up in Lebanon, and his grandma used to make prickly pear not margaritas, mixed drinks,
Yep.
prickly pear, just smoothies, prickly pear, just hydration beverages all summer long, and it was his favorite thing growing up with him and his siblings. And so one day when he was shopping at our local grocery store and he saw prickly pears in the market, he was blasted with nostalgia. He's like, I have to bring this back to my friends, and so he shared it with us. We were just blown away by the taste. And then, being in healthcare, we looked at the benefits. That was really, really
Mm-hmm.
interesting as well. And I think over time, we just realized like this is such an amazing opportunity to take a health and wellness platform, introduce an ingredient that meant something significant to one of us, and then find ourselves in this. And that journey of really discovering authenticity through the creation of Prickly and figuring out that we could leverage the platform of a cactus to inspire people to be resilient and to really promote health, happiness, and sustainability became really what our core mission was, and then over time that mission manifested itself into
Yep.
a company that we now are, privileged enough to be able to support and to grow every single day.
So I want to talk about your Shark Tank experience. You and your co-founder Mo, also pharmacist, appeared on Shark Tank season 13, episode 22. We'll link to it in the show notes if folks want to go back and watch it. And you were looking for $200,000 for 5% equity, which equates to a $4 million valuation. And I want to talk about the numbers, but first I want to hear about the experience. What was it like walking through those doors and how did you prepare for that opportunity? Because as I'll ask you in a moment, there were some instances in your responses with the sharks that it was clear you had done a lot of preparation. And so I'm curious to hear how you went about that preparation.
Yeah. So we'd spent almost 2 years just sort of beta testing our product, farmers markets, figuring out how this whole industry worked, and it was really, really something that just blew our minds because of how complex
Mm-hmm.
the industry was and the different aspects that went into it, from D2C e-commerce to retail to supply chain to operations to production to sales and marketing. I mean, there was just so much to uncover, and it took us some time to really grapple around that. So we didn't launch until February 2021. And something to note of that is I think pharmacists and STEM individuals specifically are fantastic entrepreneurs because testing is so ingrained in our DNA. So we really went through this pretty really kind of taking our emotion out of it as much as we could. But
Mm-hmm.
in any case, we launched in February of 21, and within the first week, we had run these Facebook ads, and the production studio at Shark Tank had seen one of these ads, and so they reached out and were like, "Hey, you guys should apply." And we thought it was a complete scam. We had no
Yeah.
idea this is a real thing, but we pursued it, and next thing you knew, we had this gigantic application. It was like 40 pages. I mean, we were just spewing out all aspects of our life in this application. And this ended up being like a 16-month process from when we first
Wow.
applied to when we then filmed, and then when we finally aired the following May. So it was probably the longest kept secret of our lives. And, when we started getting through the process, the team assigned us a production staff that really helped us kind of frame the pitch, prepare us for the kind of conversations that we were going to have. And
Okay.
a lot of that was just, again, an ongoing, 16-month journey that eventually led to the air date on Mother's Day weekend, actually, May of 2022.
I'm curious. Yesterday, I was listening to a podcast of the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK, and he had talked about a moment in their business, which it took them 8 years to get to $1 million in revenue, and now they're north of $600 million a year. So very, very patient, slow growth, and then obviously, more of an explosion of that over time. But he talked about this instance where, after a lot of persistence, they got onto Oprah, a huge opportunity, couldn't hire enough people to have the phones ready after that went live. But they didn't have a same experience when they went on Ellen's show. It was actually very quiet after that, and part of that had to do with, obviously people can more easily get in touch now than they could when they went back on a previous show with Oprah. But I'm curious, how defining of a moment was that, or was that not, in terms of that goes live and the business changes?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it was a defining moment. I think a lot of companies find a lot of luck in different components. You kind of have to. I mean, timing, luck, it's in every company's journey. And Shark Tank is manifested as one of those things for us, for sure. We had been on this like interesting media tour leading up to Shark Tank. We had actually filmed Today Show in August, right before we had filmed Shark Tank in September. And that was a pretty big deal. I mean, Al Roker drinking your product on air, I mean, sharing your story.
Pretty cool.
And we definitely got some texts about it, but it wasn't comparable to
Yeah.
the Shark Tank experience. I mean, I think there's something societally and culturally relevant about Shark Tank and the connection that, every person has with that being like some pinnacle of entrepreneurship and a goal that I think, a milestone I think a lot of people will look for when starting businesses. So I think that there's something innately exciting about it, and still to this day, anytime people see our booth, our materials, see us out in public with Pricklee, like we definitely get people being like, oh, we saw you guys on Shark Tank, and we always, the number of times we've had to tell the story of like, what was that like, it's, we
I'm
don't get
sure.
tired of it. It's definitely something that we're passionate about, but it was definitely one of those things where that was absolutely a Shark
Yeah.
Tank.
Not once, I don't think, not once did you or Mo mention that you were a pharmacist on that show. Was that an intentional move?
I think we actually did, but
Oh, did you?
well, so the time that you're in there is quite a bit longer than what actually gets aired. We think we were in there for almost 45 minutes. It was cut to 8. They did a really good job of actually representing the conversation, the negotiation,
Okay.
the intent of it. But I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, they're trying to put on a good show and trying to make it very, very snappy and quick. And it was funny. We had a couple of our partners and friends actually fly in and put on Cactus suits to introduce the brand and the products, and that entire segment was cut out. So it was really funny. I mean, they were there, you saw them, but the whole dance sequence entrance that was cut out. I guess they weren't. I guess we just didn't rehearse well enough, or like it wasn't entertaining enough for dancers across the U.S. But yeah, no, we talked about it I think a couple times, but definitely within a 45-minute segment, they cut that down to 8 minutes.
So one of the things, Tim and I were talking about this, Tim, my partner at YFP last week, who does a lot of teaching on negotiation. And one of the things that happened in the Shark Tank episode, at least of the 8 minutes that they filmed, is when Kevin, he went on this rant of, I hate beverage deals. However, I like this product. And he ended up countering at, I think it was $200,000 for a 20% stake instead of a 5% stake. And then you had a brilliant response. And you said something along the lines of, how are we supposed to do that? And then you provided the rationale behind the how are we supposed to do that in terms of needing the cash flow and so forth to grow and sustain the business, which is a textbook calibrated question for negotiation. And the book, How I Split the Difference, Chris Voss, he talks about this question precisely. So I assume you were prepared for that specific type of instance where you had to negotiate. Was that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no Shark Tank deal goes on air and comes out the way that it was presented. And, it was kind of incredible how textbook the negotiation went to how we had prepared. We'd expected them to go to 20%. We expected Kevin in the negotiation to then go to a royalty deal if we reduced to 10. And then our whole bottom line was going to be to offer the initial deal at a 5% line of credit. So the fact that it played out
okay.
to a T was just mind blowing, I think, in terms of the preparation of that.
Yeah.
and to feel like we were actually in control of the entire conversation was pretty.
Yeah.
One of our first actual advisor, Patrick Muldoon, who's the previous CEO of Zola Coconut Water and Detour Bar, incredibly brilliant guy. He was the one that, to your point, brought up Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. We read that. We kind of really prepared what happens when this likely scenario occurs that somebody's going to, let's say you're left with one shark and you have an offer and it's 20%. And the fact that it, again, happened at that exact moment was really funny. This is a guy who's gone through so many tough negotiations in his life. And, I think can really speak to experience with it. And just, he kind of coaches the same thing. Like at the end of the day, when you're in a tough situation, I think that the best thing to do is ask questions, right? When you're faced with an impossible situation, impossible task or ask, which oftentimes is the case with Shark Tank, like these deals are impossible deals.
Yeah.
Like you ask the question of lean into their expertise and experience and figure out what is it that they're looking for. And oftentimes that opens up the conversation, right? From seeming like you're back against the wall, no counter, this is the final offer on the last shark, to then turning that into an actual conversation where that results in a negotiation. Yes. I mean, that's absolutely part of the game.
It was interesting seeing Barbara jump back in. I didn't see that coming. And then, I thought it was cool that you guys got caught a little bit in the middle for the benefit of at least the show where, there's obviously an ego play going on between the two of them that, she so that was fun to watch.
Yeah. We were like, was this about us?
Right. Quan, I'm curious that as your role expands, obviously you're leading a rapidly growing beverage company. I don't think any schooling, including a PharmD program, and even one that has more of an entrepreneurship focus, I don't think any schooling can prepare someone for the work and the leading that you're doing now. And I'm curious, what skills, if you had to pick one or two, we just mentioned negotiation, potentially one, what skills have you really had to develop and hone that have proven to be most valuable to you in terms of leading this company?
Wow, it's hard to boil that down. So I would say if it really comes down to it, I think leadership is definitely the one that has been the most difficult for me, because I don't know. I think leadership is often put together as this package of people and roles in leadership positions, quote unquote, and that's oftentimes rewarded.
Yep.
And there's often momentum built around that, right? If somebody tends to be active and speak up, this tends to happen. But you really realize over time that it's really not about that. It's really about how do you serve the people, your constituents, your workers, your partners, your friends, your customers, right? Yep. And your vendors, everyone that you work with, and finding a voice of authenticity and a mission that's so much greater than the product that you're selling, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, and making sure that that's an authentic mission and a set of value systems that really represents the people that are truly behind this company. Because the company really is just a journey. It's really a journey of humans coming together, bringing their talents, introducing their networks of other talented individuals to come through. And so at the end of the day, does a product really matter, or is it really the people that come together to make it come to life? And I really kind of believe the latter.
Yeah.
Certainly to some extent, but that was a really hard thing to understand, because I think the skills that, again, the leadership skills that are oftentimes rewarded in a corporate setting are oftentimes selfish, right? And ones where it's like, what are you good at? And you tend to see this too with a lot of individuals that, when they find themselves in conversations with senior leadership, for example, which oftentimes isn't the case in a corporate American setting. I mean, most of the time it's a jockeying of position of like, this is what I've done. This is how I'm effective. This is what I've led. And it's like, that doesn't really provide a lot of value in a conversation, right? I mean, the ultimate value, understandably, for any business is to move forward as a company, because that improves everyone's livelihood and ultimately your customer's livelihood, right? And so, I think when you look at it in that macro, you realize it's not about the individual, it's about the bigger piece of like, what are we all working for? And realizing that the individual growth journey will actually lead to overall growth of the business. But again, if you come from a place where you're thinking about your specific role in that, as opposed to looking top down on how do you truly cultivate a culture of growth, it's really hard to understand how to take yourself out of that, and turn it the other way around, right? And reflect all of that growth towards others while still finding that your personal growth journey is actually about that.
Yep.
So that was a really, really extensive journey that I'm still on. And And I think there's that a lot of the people in my team and partners have been extremely patient, with me through that. That I would say has been the hardest, most emotionally intelligently challenging thing
Yes.
and process that I think I still undergo. And I still I'm so in awe of people that have mastered that.
Hmm.
And I see how they bring that home to their families too,
Yeah.
and that's really, I think, what keeps me excited about the growth journey in that specific way.
I love what you just said there. And I think you can relate to this as a relatively newer dad, but I think parenting and entrepreneurship, at least in my own journey, have really forced some of the most significant inner reflection, which can be humbling and painful sometimes in the moment of like, my kids, I love them to death, but parenting exposes every limitation I've ever
Yeah.
had that I was able to hide.
Yeah.
I think entrepreneurship can do the same, but I think if you lean into that, as I hear you are, it's such a rich and rewarding journey of what are the opportunities to grow and to develop and to flourish and to really think about some of these bigger questions of, sure, there's going to be opportunity to build some wealth and, create jobs and provide a really cool company and a product that's awesome and tastes great. I can attest to that. My boys and wife can attest to that have tried the product as well. But it's bigger than that, right? It's bigger than that. And you're already, talking about that. And I think that bigger than that also enhances the product and it makes it attractive to people that are using it and the team that is behind that. It's just it's energizing when you have that type of a mindset.
Oh my gosh, you hit it on the head. I mean, that same mentality when you apply it, to your point, I mean, having a kid immediately puts somebody significantly ahead of you in terms of priorities, and that is what you have to do with entrepreneurship too, right? And it's really just not about you. It's
Hmm.
about the people that you serve. And I think when it comes to product, that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, as soon as we launched our product, we already knew that we were selling a product and we had to find authenticity in our journey to express a brand.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it was. And it just so happened that I had my daughter in that really existential brand searching, soul searching phase. So it actually really helped us
Yeah.
internalize like what it meant to feel empathy for
Hmm.
consumers in that way and build a brand that really spoke to their needs as opposed to a brand that we wanted to express ourselves. And then finding
Yes.
that like common ground of authenticity so that when we build everything, it feels like a true genuine expression of self as
Hmm.
opposed to here's a list of factors and characteristics of this product that you should buy into.
Yeah.
And so sort of I think there's a really interesting tidbit on that I'd love to share, which is growing up in STEM, we were kind of taught to look at data and place data at a level of gospel sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Where like the higher the n, for example, the more statistically significant, the more correct this data point ends up being. And that is absolutely, true. And there's obvious logical science built into that way of discerning data. And then simultaneously, you do have occasional situations where a clinical trial may fail, yet
Yeah.
you have individual patients that may be cured of cancer.
Hmm.
Does it necessarily mean that the product is not good, or was it not tested in the right patients? I mean, you start to answer a lot of these
Yeah.
interesting questions. But the reason I bring that up is because this comes back to the value system of healthcare, which is it's interesting because within healthcare, we're tasked to be compassionate to care for our patients, and there's sometimes like a disconnect with the way that we think about our jobs and the way that happens because
Yeah.
when you look at data sets, you're taught to think that the higher the data set, the more accurate, the more useful this information is, almost to the point where an n of one becomes tossed away as meaningless.
Yeah.
And the irony is, as we've built in our consumer journey, we've put all of our efforts into appreciating the n of one,
Yeah.
because the n of one is actually the lived journey that every single human being on this planet is born into. Like every
Hmm.
single person goes through an n of one journey. Your journey is your journey. That's it. Your perspectives, the people that you're with. I mean, that's uniquely yours. That's what you're
Yeah.
born into. And that's what you die with. And the fact that that's held without importance sometimes, or the importance of that, the significance of that is lost in our way of appreciating that people aren't data points. People are people. And if we sometimes look at that n of one in the context of a broader, data set,
Yeah.
and find appreciation in the outliers, you actually will find a lot more answers to those questions that you may not even know you're asking for. And that's
Hmm.
that's actually where entrepreneurship really, really has taught us is we don't find a lot of value in our aggregated success. Aggregated success is just the status quo of what's working.
Yeah.
And we have so much failure that there's no real, n of one failure that you're looking to innovate on. But occasionally we get an n of one that just blows our mind. How did that happen?
Yep.
Like, where is that coming from? Why is that happening? And that insight that we get picking up the phone, talking to that one person, can shift business strategy in ways that are so significant and unlock, opportunities that we had never considered.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because we value that N of one. And I think if we look at that in healthcare and truly ask those questions, those deeper questions of making sure we don't lose that context in the scheme of pursuing, greater science, I think we can probably affect the holistic health of patients in a greater way, as an industry. So that's something that, again, going back full circle to your question of institutions, is something that as a value system, we should probably try to find a way to embed in our curriculum.
Great insights, Quan. Really have enjoyed the conversation. I'm excited to get this out to the YFP community. Where is the best place that folks can go to connect with you and to get involved perhaps in Pricklee as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us, for myself personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's just Kun, Kun, last name Yang, Yang. And yeah, feel free to connect and reach out if you ever want to have a conversation. Would love to meet other pharmacists and hear about your journeys. And then also, it just so happens that we actually are just opening our seed investment round for Pricklee as well. So if that's something of interest, please feel free to reach out and let us know if you have any questions or want to learn a little bit more about that opportunity as well.
Awesome. We'll link to both the Pricklee site as well as Quan's LinkedIn profile in our show notes. Quan, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, Tim. I had a great time.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.